Good afternoon. I think we can get started. I hope we can keep your attention for one more session, the last session of the day. And so this session is designed to highlight one of the most important data collection activities and data dissemination activities of ERF, which is the labor market panel surveys. And we are highlighting today results from the Egypt labor market panel survey of 2023, the last wave of which was in 2023. But it's a longitudinal survey that has been going on since 1998. And there have been 5 waves of this longitudinal survey in Egypt since 1998. Right now, we are in the field to implement the 3rd wave of the Jordan labor market panel survey, which started in 2010, and the 2nd wave in 2016, and 2025 is the 3rd. And we have plans to go back and do the 2nd wave of the Tunisia survey this year, hopefully, or early next year. And then we did one in Sudan as well before everything fell apart in Sudan. And we're hoping to expand this activity to other countries of the region. So if you have ideas and funding and desire to be champions of this very important work, please come and see us. So today we're highlighting the 4 of the papers that came out of the Egypt labor market panel survey of the 2023 wave. And there are many more papers in the working paper series of ERF, as well as the policy briefs. And so together with me today, I have a group of wonderful researchers who have contributed to this work. I'm going to introduce them first quickly now, and then I will present the first paper, and then we'll move to the other papers. So I have to say, yes, Dr. Mona Said, she just received her PhD, is an assistant lecturer of economics at the Faculty of Economics and Political Science, Cairo University. I think she's joining us remotely from India. And Dr. May Gadalla, who both co-authored the paper on income and wage inequality. Dr. May Gadalla is the manager of the data group at ERF and also associate professor at Cairo University. Ms. Rawane Yasser is research officer as the French Development Agency. And Ms. Mona Amer is representative of the Agence Universitaire de la Francophonie in Egypt, which she just took on that job, so congratulations, and is a longtime researcher with ERF. And then our discussant today is Dr. Mona Said, who is an ERF research fellow and professor of economics in the School of Business at the American University in Cairo. So the first paper that I'll be presenting is on the evolution of the structure and quality of employment in Egypt, 2012 to 2023. The second paper will be on trends in income and wage inequality in Egypt, going all the way back to 1988. The third paper, which will be presented by Rawane, is the use of information and communication technology in the workplace in Egypt. And then finally, the last paper is Mapping Egypt's Green Jobs, which is by Professor Hal Abu Ali, who's not on stage with us, but she's somewhere around, and Dr. Mona Amer. And this paper is joint work with my PhD student, Isra Mahmoud, who is currently in Minnesota doing her PhD. Okay. So I like when I present the work since I can go on forever, and I asked Mona to keep tabs of time for me, to give you the bottom line first. So what have we found? And so as you know, this survey is a periodic survey. And so we're really comparing 2012 round with 2018 and 2023. And there's been some noticeable improvements in Egypt's employment situation between 2018 and 2023. A lot of people are surprised when we say something improved in Egypt, but that's the reality. We have a slight acceleration of employment growth rates. We have the share of private formal wage employment growing, and that means the private sector is generating somewhat better jobs. There is less precarity in employment and better access to benefits, and self-employment is growing rapidly. And also, when we ask people about their own subjective sense of job satisfaction, they actually have more job satisfaction in 2023 than in 2018. Now, these developments, positive as they are, can be attributed to a couple of things. The first is this category of employment, which we refer to as informal wage employment outside of establishments. That mouthful is essentially casual work, and it's mostly casual work in construction and transportation and agriculture. That category of employment, after booming in the previous period, has been declining. And it's very low quality employment. So there's a structural change away from this casual work type of employment. And there is a re-emergence of what I call the missing middle of the Egyptian economy, which is made up of small and medium enterprises. And these are enterprises that provide better jobs, more likely to be formal and more likely to be regular. And those types of enterprises have been growing faster, at least employment in them has been growing faster than average. So that's the nice part of the picture. There's always a dark side. And the dark side is that not everyone has been lifted, all boats have not been lifted together. And women in particular have faced a much different employment situation, with deterioration in both in terms of quantity and quality of employment. And there has been continued decline of public sector, which we know adversely affects women because they are much more dependent on that kind of employment than men. And they face obstacles for full-time work in the private sector. So private sector wage employment for women has actually declined in absolute terms. And the formalization of private sector employment has been more or less limited, not just to men, but to more educated and more affluent men. So that not all boats have been lifted by these improvements. So I'm going to talk quickly about the macroeconomic trends of employment and unemployment. Now, the evolution of the structure and quantity of employment from both the extensive margin, who works and who doesn't, and the intensive margin, the hours of work and and whether people are underemployed or not. And then I'll talk a little bit about the quality of employment, the evolution of the quality of employment. But you've heard the bottom line, and even if I don't get time to get to all my slides, you will have known the bottom line. So Egypt development has been characterized by high volatility in growth rates. So the dark line in the middle is the GDP growth rate, and you can see that it is very volatile. Now, this volatility in growth rates is not reflected in volatility in employment rates. So the top line, the orange line, is the employment rate, which was rising from 2000 to 2010. Employment rate was going up, reached a peak in 2010, and then since from 2010 all the way to 2020, it's been declining, despite the fact that growth declined and then went up. Employment rates have been declining all the way through the COVID year of 2020 and only recovered slightly since 2020 from 40% to 42%. So that's the overall employment rate, which is the employed divided by the working age population. The unemployment rate has actually peaked around 2014, 2015, and started declining before employment rates starting picking up. So the unemployment rate is kind of disconnected from the employment rate. You'd expect that unemployment would decline only when employment goes up, but it started declining before that. And that's because labor force participation has been declining. So a lot of people who would have been unemployed, a lot of women in particular, are now saying that they're not in the labor force anymore. They've withdrawn from the labor force. So the unemployment rate declines in Egypt because of these, partly because of demographic reasons. There's a slowdown in the growth of the group that's most likely to be unemployed, which is educated young people. And there is also a slowdown in participation among young women. Now, that's going to change because the demographic picture, as I said earlier this morning, is going to change dramatically with a big increase in entrants coming into the workforce in the next 10 years because of so-called echo to the youth bulge. So expect unemployment rates in Egypt to start picking back up. I'm sure that's a message the government doesn't want to hear. Now, what about the structure of employment? And here, it's a bit of a complicated picture, but I want you to focus on the dark two parts of the bars at the very right side. And those are public employment and formal wage employment. And as you can see, the share of those two categories, which really are the share of formal employment in the economy, has been declining over time. So overall, Egypt has been informalizing as those two components decline. However, formal private employment went from 9% of employment in 2018 to 11% in 2023. So the private sector itself is formalizing as the category that creates the largest part of private wage employment, which is informal private wage employment outside establishments, those casual jobs I was talking about, declined from 23% in 2018 to 20% in 2023. So there is a restructuring of wage employment in the private sector away from informal employment outside of establishments towards formal employment, which is a very good and positive. So let's look at that from a growth rate perspective. I think you can see it a bit more. Overall, you see that total employment growth rate went up from 1.1% per year in 2012, 2018 to 1.5% per year. So there's an acceleration of employment growth, a slight acceleration to 1.5% per year. But you can see that public sector employment has continued to decline and accelerated its decline. That's gone from negative 1.5 to negative 2.2% per year per annum. Formal private employment, which was declining in the previous period, has reversed and is now increasing rapidly to 4.4% per year. So this is the best news so far, and the picture is how formal private employment is accelerating. And you can see that that comes at the expense of informal private employment, both inside and outside establishments. Now, the other big news is the growth of self-employment. Self-employment has accelerated, in fact, from 2.5% per annum to 11.8% per annum. So this is really a big, big piece of the story. Unpaid family work is declining, and that's part of the change in modes of production in Egypt. Now, what about for women? And you can see for women, the picture is quite different. The total, after having increased at 1.4% per annum in the previous period, is now declining in absolute terms. So female employment has been declining in absolute terms, despite a growth of the female population of about 2% per year. And partly it's because of public sector, where the women are much more reliant on public sector work, the acceleration in the decline in that, as you can see from the very top there. The private formal wage employment, which was increasing rapidly for men, is declining in absolute terms for women. After having risen to 5.2% per annum, is back to negative 2.3% per annum. So again, that formalization is exclusively limited to men, and women are not sharing in that formalization of employment. Okay, the only important kind of development for women is the acceleration of self-employment. Both employers and self-employed are accelerating for women, which is kind of a bright spot that we... All right, now what about the distribution? I don't show these graphs, but we can show very clearly that it's only richer men in the higher wealth quintile who are benefiting from that formalization, and more educated men who are educated at the secondary level and above, and somehow very rich women as well, or women in the top quintile are benefiting to some extent. So what about structural change in the economy? And here we see agriculture continuing to decline, that we see everywhere. The share of manufacturing had been declining but has recovered, so that the economy is starting to generate more manufacturing jobs. The share of construction that had been booming and is now declining. I consider that to be good news, right? The economy had been too dependent on infrastructure and real estate for its growth, and now that's abating somehow. And then there is a growing share of services such as health, social care, professional financial services, transport and storage. All of these are increasing their share. But of course, the public services of education and public administration are declining as a share of the total economy. And these are the ones that are affecting women negatively. So what about what's happening within the private sector? So we got to focus on private wage employment, both formal and informal, and we see where it's located in the private sector. And you can see here that the group out of establishments, that group is about half of private sector wage employment. So it's a big chunk. And that is after booming in the previous period at 3.8% per annum, is declining at negative 0.2%, sorry, declining at negative 1.9% per annum. So that's the casual employment piece. But the one I want to point your attention to is those light gray bars in front of the 25 to 49 worker category and the 50 to 99 worker category. Those are the medium firms that are booming. And you can see their growth rates are 8.7% per annum and 6.9% per annum. So that's the return or the reemergence of the missing middle of the economy, which is really good news. Now, this is a complicated figure, but I'm going to kind of summarize it for you. Essentially, overwork is increasing. The ILO considers 49 hours or above per week as being excessive work hours. And the share of employment, that is, share of employees that are doing excessive work hours, is growing dramatically. So in the formal private sector, has gone from 42% to 57%. These are people working more than 49 hours or more per week. In the informal private sector, has gone from 52% to 67%. So there is a tendency for at least the quantity of employment on the intensive margin to really grow. Now, that could be the result of voluntary increases in hours, at least the workers agreeing to them if they get paid overtime. Some of it may be that because their wages are going down in real terms, but it could also be the increases in minimum wages lending employers to intensify work and make people work longer hours. A standard work week in Egypt is 6 days a week, 8 hours per day. Now, that intensification of work results in what's called a decline in what's called time-related underemployment. And this is people who work part-time, less than 35 hours per week, involuntarily, because they want to work more, but they only can find work. And this is usually affects casual workers who can't find enough work to keep them busy all week. And that you can see is declining over time quite substantially as the economy picks up. Now, that type of work tends to be concentrated among the poorest, and you can see the lowest quintile is the one that has the highest shares of underemployment, but it's declining among all groups. Okay. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the quality of employment, but irregularity of employment has gone down slightly. It's kind of flattening out. So these are people who are working irregularly. The percent covered by social insurance overall is going down, but the decline has slowed down substantially in the last period. And if you look at within private wage work, there's an increase in the social insurance coverage rate. And that could be the result of a new law of social insurance law that was introduced in 2019, and that may have helped increase coverage rates within the private sector. You can see also that health insurance is going up, and is particular within this medium-sized enterprises and small enterprise category, which is picking up. Now, job satisfaction, I'm just told you the upshot, pretty much increasing. These are the percentage point increase in job satisfaction. People are saying they're fully satisfied with their job between 2018 and 2023, and they're almost all positive, which means that the people are more satisfied. Now, some conclusions. So we found that there are positive aspects: accelerating employment growth rates, formal wage employment is increasing, decline in the most vulnerable and precarious forms of employment, the missing middle is growing, the time-related underemployment is declining. So all of these are good, except that big chunks of the population, women in particular, did not share in improving labor markets, and they've experienced negative employment growth, more informalization, driven by the continued decline of public sector employment, in which that women are highly reliant on for formal work. So this kind of inequality needs to be corrected in the Egyptian labor market. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We are going to present our paper on trends in income and wage distribution in Egypt, authored by Dr. Mai Gadallah, Mariam Hagag, and myself. Next. The presentation is divided into two main sections, in addition to the introduction in section 1 and the conclusion in section 4. Section 2 tackles wages in Egypt, covering wage distribution, trend, and inequality. And section 3 focuses on income, namely income distribution, trend, prevalence, diversification, and inequality, and its decomposition. This paper aims actually to examine trends in income and wage distribution and inequality in Egypt over the period from 1988 to 2023 at a disaggregated level, namely based on gender, sector of employment, education, skill, age, and location. The study draws upon all waves of the Egyptian labor market panel survey starting from 1988. And the study also decomposes income inequality by income source to see the contribution of each income source to overall income inequality as measured by the Gini index. Wage and income dimensions of inequality is studied in Egypt, especially at such a highly disaggregated level. Thus, the study contributes by filling this gap in existing literature to reach a better understanding of Egypt's economic and social dynamics. So starting by figure 1, and as you see in the figure, overall trend of real median hourly wages over the studies period shows that the median real hourly wages witnessed a major drop in 1998 from 22.7 to around 16.4 in 1994. While wages recovered notably in 2012, they dropped again in 2018 and 2023 following the inflationary pressures brought about by the subsequent currency devaluation that started in 2016. Wage trend by gender, sector, education groups is almost similar to the overall wages trend. However, we can notice that some subgroups managed to have wage improvements in 2023, such as women, public and formal private sector workers, also workers with higher education level. With respect to wage disparities, the figure shows notable wage disparities among groups, especially when wages are increasing compared to when they are decreasing. Wage disparities also tend to be higher among women than among men, as indicated by the large distance between groups' wages for women if compared to men. Also starting from 2012, women wages have been higher than that of men, and this might be because of the application of the minimum wage policy in the public sector, where women employment is dominant. Wages are typically higher also in the public sector, followed by formal private sector, then in the informal private sector. Wages finally tend to move in a monotonic way with education, so it becomes higher when education increases. This figure shows the growth of real median hourly wage by different subgroups. It confirms all conclusions about wage trends discussed in the previous slide. And again, between 2018 and 2023, we can see that few groups only managed to obtain a wage recovery. Those are circled in red, which are women, public sector workers, and formal private sector workers, and also those with high education level and high skill. With respect to this figure, it shows the evolution of relative wage change by wage decile between two periods, the first from 2012 to 2018, and the second from 2018 to 2023. In the first period, all wage deciles were negatively impacted by wage decline, especially those in the highest wage deciles. This implies, again, that a wage convergence is typically observed when wages are decreasing. In the second period, we can notice that wage decline was more pronounced among middle wage deciles. When we disaggregate the information by gender groups, the figure reveals that both men and women witnessed a wage decline in the first period, especially among the highest wage deciles. However, when women managed to attain a wage recovery, women managed only to attain wage recovery in 2023, unlike men. The study also calculated the low wage share, which is a share of workers earning a wage level that is less than the minimum hourly wage in real terms. This share is calculated by first transforming the nominal monthly minimum wage into real terms using 2012 as the base year, and then the real monthly minimum wage is transformed into hourly minimum wage, considering the normal working hours per week prevailing in the public sector. This share increased steadily from 55% to 66%, and then to 69% over the period. And it was specifically higher among vulnerable groups like men, private sector workers, low educated workers, low skilled workers, young workers, and rural workers. Only few subgroups managed to show improvement in this share in 2023, like public sector workers, workers with higher education, and also workers with high skill level. Finally, in our wage analysis, we calculated wage inequality relying on the Gini index. And as you can see from the figure, it has increased steadily since 1998 from 32.2 to 43.1. Disparities between groups could be identified, but they are not consistent over time. So generally, wage inequality is higher among relatively older age group, formal private sector workers, women, urban workers, and those with higher education level. And the reason behind this inconsistency in income inequality, in wage inequality over time, is attributed to the fact that some subgroups, typically the more vulnerable ones, witnesses an acceleration in the inequality level, such as early entrance to the labor market, informal private sector workers, low-skilled workers, low-educated workers, women, and rural workers. So now the floor is yours, Dr. Mai, to continue with wage inequality.
Thank you. This is the second part of the paper covering the household income. One, the advantage of the data, that it collected data on different income sources, such as explained in the slide. It covered labor income, wages, self-employed and employers, capital income, and transfers. And this, for the sake of this analysis, we differentiated between wages coming from the public sector, wages coming from the private, and wages coming from the employment. As for the self-employed, the earnings coming from agriculture businesses versus agricultural businesses. For the transfers, it covers the contributory pensions and non-contributory pensions. What happened between 2000 and 2023? The distribution between 3 years. It faced a sharp decline between 2012 and 2018. As you see, the whole distribution shifted to the left. In 2023, there was a slight improvement. However, it didn't retrieve the initial values of 2012. One of the things that you notice here in the graph, that there was a bulge and at the left tail of 2018, and this bulge increased in 2023, which means that the percentage of low-income earners has increased. The table beside the figure confirms the result. As you see, the median of real monthly income per capita, it declined sharply in 2018 and increased slightly in 2023, but still not the values of 2012. Looking at the whole distribution of the income, it's important to see the relative change across the entire distribution. What happened here, we looked at the relative change in each decile between every 2 successive years. Again, in 2018, the decline was very strong and even stronger in the first decile, as you see the red circle. But in between 2018 and 2023, the relative change was positive, but it's slightly close to the zero. When disaggregating this by the gender of the head of household, it's obvious here that there is a fall being the sharpest among poor female-headed households and the middle-class male-headed households in between 2012 and 2018. All male households recorded a slight relative increase in 2023, where the decline was sharpest, while almost all female households continued to record a decline. It's important to observe the prevalence of the different income sources over the 3 years. The percentage of households receiving remittances and capital income decreased almost by half. For the remittances, it decreased from 14% to 6%, which reminds us with the conclusion in the first presentation in the morning, and from 8% to 4% for the capital income. The percentage of households receiving wages from the public sector, again, it decreased, reflecting the contraction of the public sector. On the other hand, the percentage of households receiving income from household enterprises is increasing, reflecting the increase of the percentage of employers and self-employed, as Dr. Ragui had just mentioned. And it's important to notice here that the percentage of households receiving contributory pension increased from 22% to 29%. Okay, income sources, prevalence and diversification. It's here. This table actually shows details on the contribution of each source of income by gender of the head of household. Again, male-headed household are more likely to rely on wages and income from household businesses than female-headed households. And the share of pensions and remittances increases for female-headed households, although the percentage of households receiving Takaful and Karama has increased from 5 to 9%. The share actually of Takaful and Karama didn't exceed 1%, and the share of contributory pensions increases over time, especially for female-headed household, reaching 42%. And while female-headed households are more likely to depend on remittances, the share drops from 15 to 7%. This table actually shows the inequality and its decomposition. I'm going to focus on the fact that the bottom 10% of the population is receiving less than 0.5%, while the top 10% is receiving 48% in 2023, although this percentage declined from 2018 from 62. Looking at the Gini coefficient, it's slightly stable over the 3 years. it's important to know which source of income actually contributes more to the inequality and whether an increase in its share contributes to the equalization, which means reduction in inequality, or it contributes to disequalization, which means increasing the inequality. We implemented Lerman and Yitaki approach, and to summarize, a negative sign of elasticity, it provides elasticity. The negative sign of elasticity means that this source contributes to the equalization of income, while positive sign means it contributes to disequalization. It's important to notice that public wages reduced inequality in 2012. With the decrease of the share of the wages from the public sector, actually it started to contribute to the increase of inequality in 2023. On the other hand, wages from the informal sector has the largest equalization effect on the income distribution. Coming to the conclusions, currency devaluation since late 2016 have been reflected negatively on wage and income distribution. The relative decline of median wages was highest among males and low-educated, low-skilled, and informal workers, and the decline is continuing in 2023. Wage inequality shows an increasing trend over time, and this increase is more pronounced among women, low-skilled, and informal workers. There is low income diversification among households in Egypt. Actually, the majority rely on one or two income sources and mainly wages, while male-headed households recovered slightly from the income drop in 2018. Female-headed households are still facing a decrease in the income. Wages are, as mentioned, wages are the most important income source in Egypt among all subgroups, yet their shares are declining over time, particularly the public sector. The shares of remittances and capital income dropped in 2023, especially among female-headed households, while their dependency on contributory pensions increased. Income inequality shows a slight stability. However, the income shares of bottom 10% of the population dropped by half, reaching only 0.5%. Wages, especially public sector wages, are the main contributor to the income inequality, and the contribution was highest in 2018. Finally, informal private sector wages have the largest equalizing effect among the rest of the income sources. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. So I'm going to be presenting our paper on the use of information and communication technology in the workplace in Egypt that I've co-written with ELMPS from Cairo University and my colleague from AFD, Cecilia Poggi. So as the other papers in the panel, the paper is based on the Egypt Labor Market Panel Survey. Our aim in the study was to examine the characteristics of digitized work content. First, because the use of computers and the internet have undergone very important evolution in Egypt over the past decade, and also because the improvement in internet infrastructure has led to better speed and affordability that has allowed more households to have internet connection, which is why, given these shifts, it's important to understand this evolving landscape and the intersection between technology and labor as a focal point of labor market policies. So to investigate this evolution and to what extent these advances have been reflected in the labor market, we begin by exploring changes in computer and internet use, and particularly how firms has used technology to respond to COVID-19. Then we assess the different types and the prevalence of digital and computer skills, but also the skills that are required in the labor market. And finally, we look at employment through digital platforms. So first, we look at the findings on the use of computer and internet at work as a first aspect of technology adoption in the workplace through different modalities, whether the worker reports using a computer that is connected or not connected to the internet. And if the worker is not using a computer, we look at their internet use through other devices such as smartphones, laptops, etc. So in terms of types of digital technology, the figure here shows the percentage of workers who use digital technology by the different type. We see here that from 2012 to 2023, the overall use of computers or the internet among employed individuals has seen some very marginal changes, always hovering around 20 to 21% over the 3 waves. But the first thing we notice is an important gender pattern, with women more likely to use technology at work than men. And this trend has persisted across the different modalities of workplace technology use. And this is likely due to the concentration of women in formal jobs, whether in public or formal private sector jobs, where technology use is often higher. On the other hand, when we look specifically at the use of internet through mobile devices, which is the darkest color here in the graph, we see that this use of internet has nearly tripled from 1% in 2012 to reaching 10% in 2023, which indicates that there has been an important shift towards mobile and multi-device usage among the workforce. And this shift has been accompanied by the use of computers that are not connected to the internet, which is the lightest color in the graph, being nearly negligible in 2023, dropping to 1% for both men and women. Now, if we look at the use of technology by employment, we will notice there's an important variation by employment type. The technology use was the highest among public sector and former private sector jobs, with a rate of 39% of public sector workers using computers or the internet at work in 2023. In contrast, informal wage worker and non-wage workers in the bottom of the graph had much lower rates of technology use, but we do notice an important rise in technology use in other employment types, such as self-employers and the self-employed and the employers, with their use doubling from 12% in 2012 to 21% in 2023. Within the same types of employment, we also find the same consistent trend among women, the same trend that favors women, with women more likely than men to use technology, particularly in the public sector and the formal public sector. We then focus only on the use of internet through mobile devices, and we look at the profiles of workers. So to do so, we look at the top occupations that use the internet for work, and we rank them at the 3-digit level. And we find that for men, the top occupations that lead in internet usage, they include electrotechnology engineers, business service and administration professionals, finance professionals, and client information services, among others. For women, this was a bit different. The top occupations were health professionals, namely pharmacists, but also they include client information service and finance professionals. And we'll notice that these top occupations are classified as ICT specialists or ICT task-intensive jobs according to the OECD definition. In terms of sectors, we see that the top 5 economic sectors in the use of internet-connected devices for men include also financial services, real estate activities, legal and accounting activities, which is mostly in line with the top occupations we just mentioned. For women, the top economic sectors are quite different. They reflect how women are concentrated in certain sectors, for example, such as public administration and defense, human health and social work activities, and education, that were among the leading sectors in internet usage for women, which are all industries primarily concentrated in the public sector, as we've mentioned. And also they're in line with the shift to remote work and the rise of online schooling and education during the pandemic, which brings us to the next section on how the use of technology was used as a response to COVID-19 in the workplace. So first, we look at the percent of workers who did notice a change in their job since 2020. The analysis has revealed that 87% did not experience any change in their job or work or any work arrangement since the onset of the pandemic. But among those who witnessed a change, only 1% had transitioned to a remote work as a response. If you look at the type of workers who experienced this change, we'll see that the ones with more stable jobs were the most likely to experienced adjustments in response to COVID, such as public sector employees, where 14% has declared working in shifts or moving to remote work as a response to COVID. On the other hand, employers and the self-employed were particularly affected because their most important response was not working. Then we move to the second part of technology adoption, which is the supply of computer skills. Here we use a set of questions that ask individuals on their subjective perception of their computer proficiency. And when we look at the labor force as a total, we see that employed women not only used computers and the internet more than men, as we have seen before, but they were also more likely to report having proficiency in strong or very strong computer skills at a rate of 15% versus 13% of men. The highest rate of strong computer skills was observed among unemployed women at 23%. And this highlights a well-known phenomenon in the labor market where unemployment primarily affects educated workers and particularly educated women, which also allows us to further understand why women's unemployment is high. When we look at computer skills by employment type, we'll notice that the public sector, again, is where it's most likely to report strong skills. In the private sector, we have a greater number of female private sector workers having strong skills at 40% compared to their male peers at 26%. This explains even further why unemployed women were more likely than the employed to have strong skills. It's because the type of jobs that employ strong skills is either contracting jobs, such as public sector jobs, where the share of women has shrank, as we've seen in the previous presentation, or have very limited share in the labor market for women, such as private sector wage work that represents a very small employment in women's employment, which suggests that the unemployed women, mostly the educated ones with higher computer skills, are queuing for good jobs that would match their qualifications and skills. So to further understand which type of computer skills is prevalent, we dive deeper into the type of skills that are declared in the survey, and the figure here shows that the basic skills are the most common ones, which are the ones highlighted in blue, that have the highest percentage of workers reporting them as strong or very strong skills. And these are the use of spreadsheets, the use of electronic services, and the use of processing software. But on the other hand, the least common skills, which are highlighted in red, are computer systems programming and maintenance and management of ICT, which are considered as high-level skills. We now match this analysis with another set of questions on whether an individual's job require computer skills, which makes it possible to compare between self-assessment of one's own proficiency and the requirement for jobs in the labor market. We'll see here that 12% of the currently employed are in jobs requiring computer skills in 2023, which matches the share of the labor force who had reported proficiency that we've seen earlier. However, we notice a surprising downward trend between 2018 and 2023, which is somewhat counterintuitive because we've seen that the internet usage has actually increased in this period, but this decrease is observed across all occupations, and we can try to see that it may be due to the contraction of public sector employment. Okay. We've seen earlier that the public sector has witnessed a decline, and the public sector is usually a digital intensive sector, so it can explain this downward trend, but it can also due to other types of employment that do not necessarily essentially require computer skills that have expanded, such as own account work, like the employers and the self-employed. So this prompts us to even further understand the types of skills that are most required. Unfortunately, we don't have this type of information across the three waves. We only have it for 2023, so we weren't able to compare. But in 2023, we've seen that the most required skills are, yet again, the most basic skills, which are the use of electronic services and the use of application interfaces. Now we get to the final aspect of technology adoption that we looked at in the paper, which is the use of digital platforms for work purposes among the employed. We find only 0.4% who had found work through a digital platform or app, which is equivalent to 116,000 individuals. For those with a secondary job, the amount was only 0.2% who used a digital platform for their work. We look at the most frequent apps that they use. We find that the most frequent app was the location-based platform such as Uber that employed 53% of digital platform workers. And we also examine on the right to what extent employed and unemployed individuals would accept work through digital platforms in order to see the preferences towards gig work in the labor market. And we see that among the currently unemployed, only 11%, which is the last row, would accept job as a home-based gig worker, and 14% would accept a traveling gig worker. And if you compare it to other types of jobs, we'll see that this is the least popular compared to, for example, the public sector jobs at 77% or administrative assistant roles at 63%. But this is in line with a long-standing preference for public sector jobs in the labor market in general. So, in a nutshell, what we have found is that 20% of the workforce in Egypt had used computers at work or the internet for work purposes. We also noticed an important shift toward mobile and internet-reliant technologies across the workforce. The use of computers and the internet was found to be much more common in formal jobs, mainly the public sector and former private sector. However, it has also spread among own account workers. Women's use of technology for work is more than men, mainly due to their higher concentration in the sectors, informal sectors. And even within formal sectors, women have used computers and the internet more than their male peers. Regarding computer skills, women are again more likely to have proficiency in computer skills, especially unemployed women. And all of this would imply that it's important to invest in digital intensive sectors and that it would tackle two birds with the same stone. First, it would provide potential employment opportunities for individuals with strong computer skills who are searching and queuing for jobs that match their skills. And second, it would expand sectors like providing formal jobs that can represent an employment source for women. Another policy implication would be to expand technology adoption to other digital emerging sectors like education and health, which are two sectors that are relatively less intensive in technology adoption, but would greatly benefit from the use of technology in the quality of their services. Particularly important is the investment in education to cope with the rapidly emerging new forms of technology such as AI. And another important policy implication concerns promoting and supporting digital entrepreneurship through policies that would improve the business environment and the access to finance for own account workers, for example, by making tax payments easier and more predictable. Thank you.
Good afternoon. So I'm going to present a paper co-authored with Hala Abou Ali, who is here with us. It's about green jobs and the mapping of Egypt green jobs. What we are trying to study is the scope, the characteristics of green jobs in Egypt, and also if they are attractive or not compared to non-green jobs. So whereas green transition is one of the key goals of the sustainable development strategy for Egypt, there is a lack of or very scarce comprehensive studies on green jobs in Egypt. And so we're happy to have new incorporated questions in the last wave of the Egypt Labor Market Panel Survey on, so new question based on the ILO framework of employment in environmental activities. So we examine the prevalence and characteristic of green activities and their degree of greenness. Also where these green jobs are in terms of economic activities, in terms of occupations, and also we compare, as I said, the attractiveness of green and non-green jobs, looking at wages, at social benefits, and job stability. So first, what is our approach? We have used the ILO approach to define green jobs, but also employment in environmental activities. So in the ELMPS 2023, we can identify individuals whose jobs involve producing or using specific environmental goods and services in two types of activities: environmental protection activities or resource management activities, for instance, renewable energy, energy efficient goods and technology, recycling, but also prevention, reduction, and removal of pollution and air emission, also environmental awareness, research, planning, maintenance. So according to the ILO, there are two types of employment in environmental activities. Those jobs focusing on producing outputs, environmental goods and services. And the second type of employment is jobs involving sustainable process. And we also have a combination of both. So we can have jobs that are focusing only on output, also jobs that are focusing on process, and jobs that are focusing on both output and process. Some example, very easy examples, in terms of output, we can have like an individual working in a factory producing electrical vehicle, or for instance, a farmer specialized in organic farming. And in terms of process, we could have any type of employment that is, for instance, trying to reduce energy consumption, whether or not the end product is eco-friendly. Here we use the term green jobs, but it's not for simplicity and for simplification, but actually, what we have just defined is only employment, what is called employment in environmental activities. According to the ILO, they have a stricter definition for green jobs. They have to be also decent jobs in terms of wages and in terms of social insurance coverage. But for simplicity here, and because our data, the share of green jobs, according to the strict definition of the ILO, is very small in our sample, we have a broader definition that I'm calling green jobs just for facility. Out of around 26 million workers in Egypt, only 2.1 million workers are employed in green activities, are mainly in the private sector, 1.7 million, and they are mainly main workers, 1.8 million. In terms of share, green jobs represent only 7.8% of total employment. And we have some disparities across gender and across public and private sector, where the share of green jobs in the private sector is higher than in the public, 8% compared to 7.1%. And we have a higher share of green jobs among male workers, 8.1% as compared to 6.2% among female workers. So if we, in terms of what type of activities are they focusing on, output, process, or a combination of output and process, the majority of green jobs are combining output and process, around 43% of green jobs, followed by around a little more than a third of green jobs that are focusing only on process, and finally 22% are focusing only on output or production. There are some disparities between public and private, between men and women, but these disparities do not change the classification of these three types of environmental categories. What type of green aspects are involved in green jobs? So we have 9 types of aspects or dimensions. And clearly, overall, a few aspects are most common. Renewable energy, then sustainable agriculture, energy efficiency, water efficiency, and recycling. And to a lesser extent, we also have green jobs that are also involving pollution prevention and environmental protection. There are public and private sector disparities. The public sector is more active in renewable energy, energy efficiency, water efficiency, environmental protection, awareness initiatives that are very, very small in the private sector, and research, also very different than in the private sector. And in the private sector, the most important environmental dimensions are sustainable agriculture, recycling, and pollution prevention as compared to the public sector. We also looked at how green, what is the intensity of green jobs, to look at how many green dimensions do we have in green jobs. And very clearly, green jobs are not very green. 55% of green jobs have only one green aspect, and 75% of green jobs have two aspects, and only the majority is clearly to one or two only aspects among the 10 aspects that were identified. So there are also public and private sector disparities, gender disparities, but overall, we have the same, not exactly the same distribution, but there is always one or two dimension dominating, with some disparity in terms of, for instance, men in the private sector are more likely to specialize in a single green aspect or in 4 or more green aspects. Where can we find green, the larger shares of green jobs by economic activity? They are primarily in 3 sectors. First, utilities, including electricity, water supply, gas, and also waste management and sewage. And it's followed by agriculture, 18%, and manufacturing and mining. And there are some disparities between men and women. Men have high representation in green jobs in agriculture, manufacturing, construction, ICT, professional and administrative services. Because these new questions were incorporated only in the last wave of the Egypt Labor Market Panel survey, it's difficult to present a trend in terms of how a green job have changed over time. But what we are looking at here is the top activities where we find the most intensive green aspects in jobs. So we have identified around 15 economic activities in agriculture, such as cereal farming, cattle and buffalo raising, oil extraction, power supply and water supply, electrical installation, plumbing and heat and air condition services, vehicle repair, appliance and clothing retail, second-hand retail, food service activities, and public administration and primary education. And what is clearly shown here is that among these top economic activities in terms of green intensity, a few of them have been growing over time between 2012 and 2023. Like crop support, oil extraction and power supply, and also food service activities. And for the other economic activities, we can see a decline. Overall, the decline is larger than the increases in some of these top activities. So overall, jobs in these green intensive activities have been declining. What is the occupational profile of green jobs? It's very clear here that we have a dominance of skilled agriculture workers. They represent green jobs in this occupation represent 17%, whereas for other occupation, the share of green jobs is around or lower than the national average. So now we are looking at the attractiveness of green jobs in terms of wages when we are comparing hourly wages in green jobs versus non-green jobs. And I hope you can see it, but on the right side of the graph, hourly wages overall are very similar in green jobs and as compared to non-green jobs. There are some disparities, but usually, at least for overall, the gaps in terms of wages are very, very small, except for women in the public and the private sector, where the gaps between green and green jobs are larger. But overall, we cannot say that green jobs have a clear advantage in terms of wages. Finally, last graph, in terms of social benefits and job stability, we have compared the share of social insured jobs, jobs with formal contracts, jobs with health insurance and regular employment, comparing green and non-green jobs. And clearly here, we have green jobs have an advantage in all these categories, these social benefits. We clearly see that green jobs are more attractive for all these social benefits, social insurance, formal contract, health insurance, and regular employment. The only exception is for women in the private sector, but otherwise, green jobs are better in terms of social benefits. So finally, key findings. In terms of scope, the share of green jobs is very small, only around 8%. And it's mainly present among men and in the private sector. Most green jobs address only one environmental dimension. And in terms of attractiveness, we don't see an overall wage premium. But in terms of social benefits, overall, green jobs are better. And finally, in terms of sectoral focus, what we can say is that green jobs are concentrated in a few sectors, like utilities, agriculture, and to a lesser extent in manufacturing, mining, public administration, education, and health. And what is missing here, one important sector is transportation. So clearly expanding multidimensional green jobs in manufacturing, utilities, and transportation is key for sustainable growth. And it's also, I don't know if it's worrying, but there is a large decline in terms of employment in top green jobs. And I will end here. Thank you.
So now we have Dr. Mona Saeed, who's going to be serving as a discussant from afar. I hope Mona is online.
All right. First, a great pleasure to be in this, panel of friends and young, old colleagues and friends. I owe a lot to the Egypt Labor Market Panel Survey, different rounds of it, and I can see it continued in the same vein of encouraging and capacity building amongst the authors. Where you would have, one experienced and some younger about to finish their PhDs, kind of authors, and those four papers were very well selected to be representative of how every round really adds to our knowledge compared to the previous publications on Egypt. And also this time, two papers were more forward-looking due to having those modules added where we can study the use of information and communication technology and the labor market shifts to transition to green economies. So, you know, I do have a lot of comments because, you know, there are 4 papers and I have a lot of slides, but I know I'm allowed only a maximum of what, 10 now, not even 15 minutes, Ragui?
10
yes?
would be good, but we can give you up to 13.
Yes, right. So what I'm going to do is first go through, I'll go through them in 2 bulks. You know, the first one is the first 2 papers presented today by Ragui and the second one by May and Mona on the evolution. So really they're about the changing structure of the Egyptian labor market. And this will give me a chance to reflect because I was involved in research using the previous rounds. It will give me a chance to comment on what are the new things we learned and what seems to be persistent issues with the Egyptian labor market, whether on the employment or the wage side or employment quality also side. And then the other 2, you know, I will just have, you know, they're all new. I think they're all new information for me, and I learned a lot from them also. And I will try to give some suggestions for further questions that can be explored, especially if they want to go through the process of writing a policy paper based on their findings. And I'm just going to have some concluding remarks with my own special area of interest and my confirmed view that labor market outcomes are still very much gendered in Egypt, and what would be the policy implications for building an inclusive labor market through sectoral and structural strategies. Right, so let's start with the mixed picture that came, you know, as those smiley and neutral and not so smiley face show about the evolution of structure and quality of employment in Egypt. So first, you know, we learned the good news that the labor market conditions have improved since 2018, despite the fact that, you know, this was the period where we had COVID and you know, the Ukraine war and the various devaluation shocks. However, you know, this has not been evenly distributed. So although we can see signs overall of formal private sector wage jobs increasing, and therefore that reflected in better job quality, social insurance, paid leave, health coverage, and even higher job satisfaction. We see that overall. We also see for both men and women a sharp rise in self-employment, especially own account work, and a decline in informal wage work. In fact, as Ragui said, a lot of those results are driven by the decline in informality, outside establishment, and the so-called emergence of Egypt's missing middle, or the SMEs. Now, the ELMPS is particularly good for this type of analysis, for revealing what's happening in the informal sector and small enterprises, because they are not covered in other sources of labor in Egypt. You know, which might be establishment, even though they have improved, they might be establishment based, or, you know, the coverage is not, you know, the kind of questions included in them are not enough to tell us, you know, the details. Now, there are still persistent challenges, as we said. So, you know, so overall, employment growth accelerated slightly, we should say. Public sector employment continued declining. Private formal wage employment reverses decline, and informality declined, and self-employment is growing. Now, the picture is different for women, except, you know, the only bright spot is that, you know, self-employment or own account has also increased for women, but employment growth, employment population ratios have been negative. You know, the growth has been negative or declining. Public sector decline is much larger for women. And that really explains a lot about so many other indicators, not necessarily in the papers presented today that we see, such as, you know, a sharp decline in female labor force participation, to again scandalous level by international standards. You know, after rising for a while, former private wage employment for women, which gave us, you know, the impression that discrimination is on the decline. It has unfortunately has grown quite drastically, you know, based on the most recent data. Right. So, you know, I'll go right away and talk about the policy implications because there was a very good policy brief written. So, of course, you know, inclusive formalization in terms of the new social insurance law of 2019, it had shown to have slowed down informalization, but this has been limited to wealthier men. And women are kind of and informal workers and self-employed workers seem to have been left. So there is a recommendation that the social insurance law should try to include more, you know, some of those uncovered individuals such as the gig workers, platform workers, and non-standard jobs. But I should say that it doesn't really address how do we, you know, overcome the fact that, you know, women are simply not employed with employers that are willing to cover, to pay social insurance. Now, SME development and the missing middle is another new area of policy implication. I mean, it has always been there, but we have evidence, you know, on how if we accelerate the SME growth, you know, the typical, you know, removing red tape, regulatory compliance, removing market barriers to privilege large firms, how that is likely to keep improving our labor market outcomes. Another thing is, of course, about you know, women's employment decline in quantity and quality, and there are specific strategy to create decent jobs. But I will, you know, elaborate more on those. But my you know, first area of suggestion for extension of the analysis presented in this paper would be, you know, to go to delve more deeply into more actionable policy discussion. For example, how exactly would the formalization strategy for SMEs look like, and try to find evidence to support that, and what regulatory changes drove this growth in self-employment, so we can continue in that direction and make sure it is associated with better quality jobs. Other suggestion for extensions, and in my view, some unanswered questions, is, you know, the kind of the structural breaks. You know, it's a relatively long time. We had all those shocks happening, 2019 to 2023. So this rise in self-employment and decline in informality, I think it deserves maybe deeper econometric testing and further papers where, you know, we need to see whether this has been driven by COVID, reforms, or sampling differences, because we don't seem to pick it with other surveys. So is it because of the differences in the, you know, the samples? So, for example, the authors mention ELMPS and LFS having divergence, but they don't fully reconcile this divergence. And I think this is interesting to explore further. Also, some interesting sectoral changes that seem quite dramatic. You know, we've seen construction employment, even though, you know, it is consistent with the fact that there is all this major infrastructure project that has been going on. We've seen that, you know, on the chart, it just goes completely the opposite direction. So, you know, in terms of the growth rate. So is it simply due to public sector shrink? Or does it have to do with something else, given that it's, you know, it's a mink? So it's worth, you know, exploring whether this is something that was just picked in that particular year for some particular reasons, 2023, or is this a trend that we can rely on? The growth of female self-employment, given that we're going to base a lot of policy implications and hope on it, you know, we also want to understand, is this just women unable to remain in wage employment after marriage? You know, it remains to be seen whether this is truly remunerative work, good, you know, they well paid, or is it a survival type of self-employment? So it's worth really, you know, going in more depth and studying this, because we are left with an unanswered discussion. Are we going to see women moving back to formal sector employment after that, or is this, you know, it's going to be either informality or self-employment? Also, the narrative attributes women retreat from the labor market to public sector collapse, and, you know, rightly, many policy implications are based on that. but perhaps this can be tested more rigorously with a counterfactual decomposition, for example, on what portion of women's exit is explained by the public sector downsizing versus the public sector constraints, discriminatory behavior, or lack of access to women, barriers, etc. There is also a dramatic contraction in informal wage work outside establishment, especially for men. It declined for women. Of course, the ELMPS is the best type of data set that can, because we can look at defined breakdowns, formal, informal, outside establishments, but we can also model transitions and whether, workers are moving from informality to self-employment or exiting the labor force, because this seems to be what's happening with women. But, it needs to be tested rigorously. Other suggested areas for extension is, this important finding that kind of throws a dark shadow over the idea that decent work is improving, or the decency of work is improving, the fact that we have a rise in excessive hours among own account workers, signaling overwork rather than decent work. So this is an excellent finding and insight, and, just it kind of reconciles the fact that when we show a positive picture of improvement in the labor market, people don't exactly feel that way. But so, are these excessive hours more likely to be among the poor because they want to make up for lost income due to inflation, or are they having multiple jobs? Across tabulation by income quintile or poverty status could shed more light also on this. And I think, there was in the paper, a graph that showed, showed this by wealth quintiles. Now, with the job quality indicators, social insurance stagnation is framed kind of positively, that it's, after declining the coverage of social security insurance, it is at least declining at a lower rate. But the coverage really remains very low overall. The slight gains in paid leave and health insurance are mainly concentrated with males and formal jobs. And, it's good that we have, of course, the indicators, insurance, paid leave, stability, they're all informative, but there wasn't really an attempt to go further. Maybe this is left for another paper to develop a more composite, and I know the complications in coming with a good measure of a composite job quality index, because it would also require that we include wages, and the paper refers the reader to the companion paper on earnings that, I'll be commenting on in a minute. But, the discussion on job quality feels incomplete unless we pull all those threads together.
You have 1 minute left,
Oh my God, okay. I'm very late. So let me go quickly to the second paper. Again, I believe that the fact that the median wages have been declining is consistent with the previous trends. Wage inequality has increased as measured by Gini, but they do a good job in showing also other measures. And the fact that it was mostly highest in the formal private sector, and wages are the single biggest driver of income inequality. Low wage employment has been on the rise, reaching 69%. Now, the novel part, of this paper, in comparison to our state of knowledge about wage structure in Egypt, is this income diversification part, where there is, low income diversification. Remittances have been losing their place and capital income, and instead, for example, female-headed women are relying more on contributory pensions. Therefore, in their policy brief, they also suggested, that we need to enhance those contributors. But what would be more interesting from a policy point of view, in my view, is to also examine regional, and we have the data in the ELMPS with that regional inequality happening at the regional level, because, in the past, previous studies have shown that even though the national levels of inequality might be going down, there's a lot of disparities, and they're not exactly converging. However, a paper also by Ragui and Javad about wage, about opportunity inequality of opportunity has shown that there has been up to 2017, of course, that needs to be updated. There was actually a decline in the regional dimension, so it's worth looking at that. There is a mention in the, one of the main results in this paper is that wages have not declined to women, for women. But I would caution against taking this, this is just on average, the average median monthly or hourly wage. This, of course, one should really caution from this because obviously there is positive selection. Labor force participation has declined, especially for women, to drastically from 23% in 2012 to around 18% now. And
Try to wrap up, Mona. Time is up.
All right, so I would suggest looking at that. Let's go quickly to the other two papers. I will not repeat the findings, but on the ICT paper, I would suggest that we need a suggestion for extension is to, a lot of it is measured through self-reporting. So, some discussion of measurement bias should be taken into account. The heavy emphasis on desktop and laptop work may underrepresent mobile app work. The paper confirms that informal workers use ICT less, but does not quantify the productivity penalty or economic costs. I have some comments on the digital skills and labor demand, and platform work section is underutilized, maybe because of the small sample size. So some recommendation for future work would be for the authors to add a multidimensional logit or probit model to estimate likelihood of ICT use based on gender, formality, sector, and age. They can discuss policy levers such as e-skills certification, internet subsidies. They can consider including remote work trends, especially post-COVID, currently missing. For future work, they can pair ELMPS with online platform databases and other sources. I really like the analyzing the labor market shifts and the transition to green jobs. It's all new information, but it does confirm that they are really a very small proportion of Egypt's employment, and 80% of it is concentrated in the private sector. Agriculture is number one, followed by renewable energy and recycling and manufacturing. And the job quality characteristics are very interesting because here is another bright spot for women, where women in private sector green jobs earn almost twice the wages they earn in non-green jobs. So obviously, this is an area we'd find that we can promote. Again, I have some suggestion if, for them to really write a policy paper to maybe compare the results to other findings by one of the co-authors, Hala Abu Ali, on the MENA region, because the two papers are, have similar outcomes, but they went into more depth in the MENA paper. Finally, I just want to conclude that again, women have not benefited from recent improvements in employment quality and formality, as we learned. Improvements in average wages are likely to reflect a select group who remained in the labor market and was actually employed, and the private sector bias, of employers seeing women as short-term workers due to marriage and childbearing is something without interventions. Labor market reforms will reinforce those gender inequalities and exclude women from all of this formalization gain. There will be a new policy brief coming out that Ragui shared with me, and I just wanted to highlight really the kind of the known knowns and the known unknowns, the basic upshot of the policy recommendations based on those results for a more inclusive labor market for women, was to expand public spending on education, healthcare, and social care. We already knew that, and it was being discussed in many papers, and simultaneously try to reduce women's unpaid labor and create formal jobs. The new things or the known unknowns have been that, women's self-employment is possible to rise, but is this good quality employment? This remains to be studied. How can we leverage this trend by really making it, not just survival, but entrepreneurship type? How to prioritize training and support for women and credit and providing credit in the ICT, health and social work, professional service. Reverse the public sector employment is a very big result that will come up, I'm sure, as a result of what we're seeing, especially in education, where women always, dominated, had high productivity. Reform must be systematic. It combines labor policies, sectoral development, and social investment for it to be sustainable and gender inclusive. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mona. Okay, I think we don't have any time for questions. Do we, Shireen? No. Okay, we don't. We're over time, so I apologize for not opening it for questions. Thank you very much for your attention at the end of the day, and I hope you come back energized tomorrow morning for more insights. So thank you very much.